Hello and welcome to Only 2MG Inside the Crisis. I'm Brian Townsend and I'm your host. I spent 28 years in law enforcement, first as a police officer and then as a special agent with the U.S. Drug Enforcement Administration, the DEA, where I retired. I'm now the president of Only 2MG. Only 2MG is a 501c3 nonprofit dedicated to making safer communities. And we do that through training, innovative programs, and partnerships. And we tackle not only illicit fentanyl, but other public safety threats. I'm so excited. This is our first episode. We have an amazing guest. We actually originally connected on LinkedIn, and then we brought her to the Only 2MG Drug Summit earlier this year as a speaker, and she knocked it out of the park. She's got an incredible story. She's passionate. She's making positive change in this world, and I know you're going to appreciate her as much as I do. So it's my pleasure to introduce you to Dr. Kristen Gilliland.
Yes. Thank you, Brian. I'm so excited. And to be the first guest, what an honor. So I am, yes, Kristen Gilliland, and I am at the Warren Center for Neuroscience Drug Discovery. It's part of Vanderbilt Medical School. And I am a neuroscience educator. And how I got there was through, I was a professor at Cal Poly San Luis Obispo, California. And my PhD is in organic chemistry. However, I went and I love to do neuroscience research. I love to learn about the effects of drugs on the brain and how that works. And my whole mission in life when I was at Cal Poly really was to teach that to students and to teach them how drugs impact their brain. And I actually had a class that was the chemistry of drugs and poisons that was started earlier on by another wonderful faculty member, but I got to take it after she had retired and really kind of, turn it into what I did. And so I started moving towards neurochemistry, and then I actually developed my own course in neurochemistry too there. And it really was just looking at the effects of drugs in the brain, and came to Vanderbilt on sabbatical. Um, and I came after my son had developed schizophrenia, which I now believe was triggered by his use of high-potency cannabis or marijuana. And I came here because he had developed an addiction to other substances from the schizophrenia that he had had, and started taking Xanax and cocaine and heroin, and was deep in the throes of addiction. And as a mother trying to help him, he was at that point, he didn't want, he was basically just, the drugs had hijacked his brain. And so it was very difficult to reach him and get him help. And so I came out here to try and find new treatments for schizophrenia, because that was the one thing I knew that I could do to try and help him so that maybe he wouldn't take those drugs anymore. So I came out to the Warren Center for Neuroscience Drug Discovery. It's a center that finds new treatments for schizophrenia and Alzheimer's and Parkinson's, um, you know, great facility in Vanderbilt. And I started doing research there, but unfortunately, while I was out here, I lost my son to an accidental drug overdose. He was 22. His name is Anders Meisenheimer. And so I came to this point now where to really use my background, my teaching, my research to form a program, an outreach program that teaches adolescents about their developing brain, that teaches adolescents about the impact of both stress and substance use on the developing brain, particularly the impact of high-potency cannabis on the developing brain. And it took me a while to get here, but I had to do something in my son's name, and just in an attempt to not let any other family or any other child go through what we went through and he went through. So I am here now. I've been working at the Warren Center for about 6.5 years, and started this program about 3.5 years ago.
Well, I'm sorry about the loss of your son, Anders. I appreciate you sharing your journey, and I wanted to talk about that transition, and you did that beautifully. And again, I appreciate you sharing that experience.
Thank you.
Let's talk about the marijuana. uh, this is going to sound like a statement, but I promise you there's a question here as well. When people talk about marijuana, it's often described, especially by parents, as not a hard drug, or it's dismissed as, just weed. I hear that a lot, right? Just weed. And we hear a lot of parents who say, I smoked it in high school. Why can't my children smoke it now? Why, that's hypocritical for me to tell them no, or that line of thought. And what people don't understand now is the marijuana on the market now is much more potent, right? The THC. And THC is a psychoactive substance that, makes you feel high. And to give people some perspective, in the 1970s, the average THC levels were about 1 to 2%. In the 1980s and 90s, they were about 2 to 4%. And then in the early 2000s, they grew to maybe 6, 8%. And now they're consistently at 20, 30% levels, and they're just pushing the limits, trying to get higher and higher. In fact, in vaping, THC vaping, we now see concentrates of 80, 85%. And that means how much, the percentage of how much THC is in the vaping. We're talking about a pretty potent product now, and it's being backed by a lot of, there's an industry backing this with a lot of big money, right? Given your research, given your experience, what are some of the specific impacts that you're seeing on the development of the brain, especially for young people, as we know, brain development, occurs into our early 20s.
Sure. And I love to talk about this. And, I really want to give kudos to all the scientists that are doing so much of this work in the lab. And as I said, I'm kind of the messenger. So as being a teacher, I really spend so much time looking at the research that's been done and finding ways to translate it to the general public, particularly kids and parents. And so when we look at the developing brain, and what I'm talking about is adolescence. Adolescence is a period from, we'll say, roughly 10 to your early 20s or so. And the brain is going under these magnificent changes. And really, a lot of people will say, oh, when you're young, your prefrontal cortex doesn't develop until you're 25. And that's true. And so during this time period, your prefrontal cortex is really coming online and it is fine tuning itself. And all of these things that are happening are major neurodevelopmental changes. And so you might hear that when we talk about, something being plastic, like your brain is plastic, and that does happen during adolescence because of all these changes that are going on, the brain becomes incredibly plastic. So, and what I do want to say is that while these changes are going on, it makes the brain open to beautiful things like learning and, learning new sports, really being able um, to mold yourself into what you want to be when you grow up. But also, it makes the brain very vulnerable to substances, to stress. And so when a child, and I say, or an adolescent, uses cannabis or marijuana, particularly this high potency marijuana, um, it's interacting, that THC is interacting with a system in the brain called the endocannabinoid system. And it's a very long name, but endo just means kind of inside. We're looking at kind of endogenous, meaning that it's within the brain. And cannabinoid came from because THC and CBD are called cannabinoids. So it's the endocannabinoid system. And we have neurotransmitters that are like dopamine or serotonin that you might hear. We have neurotransmitters that are for this system. And their whole mission, those neurotransmitters and that endocannabinoid system and the receptors where those endocannabinoids or those neurotransmitters bind to, they're responsible for keeping the brain activity balanced or kind of working as a thermostat for the brain. Okay, so let's say if your brain is having too much activity in one area, that would look like a seizure. Like way too much activity, it might look like a seizure. If it's having too little activity in the brain somewhere, that might look like someone being unconscious. And so the endocannabinoid system is this thermostat to regulate kind of the gas and the brake of the brain. And we call that kind of homeostasis. It's meant to keep homeostasis in the brain. And so during adolescence, this is very important because of these neurodevelopmental changes that are going on. When an adolescent takes in THC, particularly high potency THC, what it's doing is it is messing with that gas and brake in the brain. And what I do want to say is that the receptor, or the kind of the catcher's mitt that catches the neurotransmitters for the endocannabinoid system, or THC, because it actually binds to the same place that those endocannabinoids go to. That receptor is called the cannabinoid 1 receptor, or CB1 receptor. And it is one of the most abundant receptors that we have in our brain. One of the most abundant. And so now it looks like when a person or an adolescent uses this high potency THC, or uses, THC cannabis, it goes into the brain and it binds to all those places where those endocannabinoids are supposed to be regulating the communication. But now the THC has hijacked that regulation. And so what we see as a result of that is we see problems with learning and memory. We see problems with development of the prefrontal cortex. We get a delayed development of the prefrontal cortex. And as far as like the reward center, which is the area of the brain where a lot of drugs, wreak havoc on, that give that pleasurable feeling that people become kind of, or that reinforcement, the reinforcement that they get from doing a drug. What cannabis does is it, basically does the same thing a little bit indirectly, but it causes that reinforcement feeling. And because kids are more, their brains are more plastic, it means that they are more susceptible to developing addiction.
Gotcha.
And so, yes.
So when I talk to people and I talk about opioids, I talk about how, we get that dopamine release, we like that feeling, and we're chasing that feeling, through multiple drug use. And ultimately our brain is going to start rewiring itself and rerouting itself to expect that drug. Is marijuana doing the same thing, especially when we have higher potency levels where, like you said, it's hijacking those areas of the brain where it's basically just rewiring it, if you will. It's messing it up so where its normal functions are now altered because of the prolonged or the high level THC. Is that?
Yeah. And what I'd say is that what THC is doing, it is having an effect on plasticity in the brain, for
Okay.
sure. And so and neuroplasticity, if I can go into that, if you don't
Yeah,
mind.
absolutely.
So neuroplasticity is the brain's ability to reorganize connections
Okay.
between neurons. So the neurons are those nerve cells that basically talk to each other and communicate and let us do everything we do in our life, everything we do, and thoughts and action, all those things. And so neuroplasticity is the ability to reorganize the connections between those neurons. And it's based upon your thoughts, your actions, your environment, your lifestyle, all of that. And so whatever you do a lot of, in reality, your brain is learning about you. It's
Mhm.
learning about you, and it's learning what you do a lot. And it says, my human does this a lot. I should keep these connections, right?
Yeah.
So that comes with, like you say about drugs, when you use those drugs, I mean, it really is your brain through plasticity. While we could use that plasticity during adolescence to learn and, grow, get better at sports, arts, music, whatever you want to do. It can also be used to habituate,
Wow.
or habituation to drugs. And so, but with THC, what we're seeing is that it changes plasticity, um, in the fact that because we're changing the communication between the neurons, when THC binds, it's basically tells the neuron that would be sending a message to another neuron, hey, let's slow this down. Let's stop doing this. Right. But the endocannabinoid system does that only when it's needed.
Wow.
And so when people use marijuana, the THC is really telling these neurons to stop prematurely, stop communicating this message. And so you have to imagine if you're looking at neuroplasticity and it's strengthened by communication or weakened by not communicating, then yes, you're changing the plasticity of the brain.
Wow. And when you're a young person and your brain's developing, that's not a good thing at all, obviously.
Right.
So how about psychosis? Can you dive into that a little bit and help me understand that?
Yes. And so the first thing I do want to say is that one, when we're dealing with psychosis, mainly we're dealing with adolescents. And that is because of their brain, going through all these changes. And I will say that uh, long-term psychotic disorders like schizophrenia and that the prime time in life when that develops is during late adolescence and early adulthood. And so that's usually when people will start to see those initial psychotic episodes happen. And what cannabis can do is, in some way, trigger psychosis. And so we don't know as scientists, and I think everybody who's out there, we can't really say that it causes psychosis. We can't say that it triggers psychosis, in a way that maybe a person, and I should say more with schizophrenia, that
Yeah.
what increases a young adult's susceptibility to psychosis or schizophrenia is one, if they're using high potency THC. And when I say high potency, that's anything above 10% THC in a product, a cannabis product, marijuana. Anything above 10% is considered high potency.
So pretty much everything on the market.
That's everything on the market. So it is. It's using high potency marijuana. It's frequency of use, and so using a lot. It's also the younger you are, because the younger you are, your brain is really remodeling itself, and the architecture is changing, and so it's more plastic, and so you have more ability to. If you're using a lot at that young age, to stop that communication, and it can really change a lot of things. But definitely, genetic predisposition is, one of the biggest things. If you have a first relative who suffers from schizophrenia or some long-term psychotic disorder, even bipolar disorder, I would say that staying away from cannabis or marijuana is essential.
Yeah, absolutely. So we can't definitively say that, 100% this is the cause, but we know that it's a trigger. We know that it statistically speaking, at least, it increases your chance for things like psychosis or other health problems or brain problems. Interesting. Okay.
Mhm.
So when one of the questions I get a lot, especially from young people, sometimes it'll be in the public and, during a Q&A, or sometimes they'll come up to me afterwards and they want to have a private discussion, which I appreciate. And they'll say, hey, I have been using cannabis. I have been using marijuana, but now you've got me thinking, I've never heard this before, that, that it's altering my brain. Um, am I in trouble? What's going to happen? How do you respond to that? How do you respond to I'm sure this has happened to you as well, when a young person comes to you and says, I've been using marijuana, but now you've enlightened me, you've empowered me with information. Is it too late? What's going to happen to me?
Right. That's a great question. And I do get that a lot. I get a lot of students that come up to me, and one of the first things I do is just, where are you at in your studies, and what are you doing? The thing I give them is that your brain is incredibly plastic. And so e- even if certain connections may have been altered, and I do want to say something that a lot of, because this will feed back into this, a lot of people don't understand that during adolescence, there's a period, what's called synaptic pruning, that happens in early adolescence, and continues on into, basically 25-ish or so is when it kind of finishes this period through adolescence. And what happens is that connections that are not being used um, we're born with this abundance of brain cells because your brain has to learn who you are, right? And it learns, like, when you're a baby, if you cry a lot, you realize that when I cry, I get held, I get changed, I get fed, all of these things that happen for survival, really, that you need. And it makes sense that you're born with so many brain cells because your brain really is trying to figure out how to keep you alive. How do, and then what do you do a lot of? And so when you reach adolescence, the brain does this kind of pruning back, and where it removes connections that are not being used because it's inefficient. So it starts to remove them. And so during adolescence, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, pruning happens. And when you look at pruning during adolescence, it's about 1% of the kind of the thickness of the prefrontal cortex is pruned. So it kind of loses, it thins by about 1% per year, just kind of looking at that volume. So it thins.
Okay.
And that's normal, completely normal. There have been studies that have shown that when, and this is a study by Alba and all et al. And he found that when you actually put kids into an fMRI scanner, and I think I want to make sure, I think it's Alba et al. Maybe I should, but a scientist who did some brilliant work found that when you put youth into an adolescence into a scanner, an fMRI scanner, so just like an MRI, but it actually looks at things real time, that to measure the thickness of the prefrontal cortex, they found that kids who use cannabis from the ages of 14 to 19 versus kids who did not use cannabis or marijuana, that their prefrontal cortex, so the kids who use their prefrontal cortex, thinned on average 30% more than kids who did not
Wow.
use.
Okay.
So
Wow.
it's changing the pruning. There's that THC is actually pruning. But if you think about it, it makes sense, because when we talked about the endocannabinoid system, about the communication, and that it decreases the amount of communication between those neurons. When the endocannabinoids bind, they do it on demand when it's needed, like to quiet the brain or turn on the gas. But THC does it, not on demand. It's whenever someone uses, right? And so all of a sudden you're quieting the communication between that neuron. And so if you think of pruning happening at that time, if that person continues to use THC during that adolescent time of pruning, you're quieting those neurons more than should be done at that time. And so they'll get pruned. And so the beautiful thing again about the brain is that it can learn ways to go different areas, like kind of wrap around doing, funky little side routes and all that kind of stuff to figure out how to connect. But
Yeah.
it is it's dangerous. And this is something that I do think that should be known nationwide, particularly in places where they're trying to push legalization.
Yeah. Which I will ask you about here shortly.
Okay.
So it's a great thing that our brain is resilient, right? It wants to bounce back, and this really just stresses the fact that this is why we shouldn't be using these drugs. Why go through this process when we can avoid it, right? When
Right.
hopefully your brain stretches back and everything's good, but the longer you do this, the more harm that you're causing, and the harder it is going to be for these things to bounce back. But wow, that's interesting. Um, so when I dove deeper into marijuana, at least more recently when I was looking at use, I was blown away by the regular marijuana user. Most marijuana out there is actually being consumed by regular users, not first-time users, not recreational users, but regular users. In fact, I saw one study that said the majority of marijuana is smoked by people who use it every 25 days a month. 25 days a month. So we have, obviously you're building a tolerance, and if I were a manufacturer, I have to build a product that meets that tolerance, right? So that's why we have higher THC levels is because when I have my regular customer, my number one customer who's putting a lot of money in my pocket is using almost every day, I've got to give him or her a product that is a lot more THC so they can get the same, high or whatever they're looking for, like they did the first or second time they used the drug. So I mean, to me, this is common sense. It's going to increase the risk, but I want to hear it, from someone much smarter than me. How does that increase the risk, to the brain and to the things we've been talking about?
Yeah. So high potency marijuana is high THC marijuana is more addictive. There's no doubt. And we're changing plasticity more, right? I mean, changing plasticity more. Um, Dopamine is getting its rush in the reward center, and we are reinforcing that use continually. I do want to say something that is interesting, though, that and this is where the problems like with the concentrates and the edibles come in.
Yeah.
Most people who smoke marijuana, it's my understanding that they know how to kind of self titrate themselves to a level to where they just get to that high.
Yeah.
But if they were to use a vape pen, something like that, they can get up to levels that are twice as much. And I really think where this is an issue is with kids, because the cannabis industry understands that if they get these kids while they're young, the high THC potency marijuana is more addictive. They know it to them when they're young. Um, a lot of them market their marketing is branded towards kids, and they look like Skittles, they look like Doritos, they look like I mean gummy bears, all these types of things that kids will be attracted to, and they know that they'll can get addicted, and then they will keep using, and then the cannabis industry, right? If they become addicted and develop cannabis use disorder, then they'll keep using. And right now, I've heard this stat that it's about 30% of people who use cannabis have cannabis use disorder.
Wow.
So yeah, so 30%. And using cannabis use disorder, I'm not sure if you've heard of cannabis hyperemesis syndrome. And so this is a syndrome where particularly people who already have cannabis use disorder, um, that they can't stop vomiting. And not only that, it is incredibly painful. And they'll end up in the emergency departments. The doctors have nicknamed the vomiting scromiting because they're screaming and vomiting at the same time. And this was something that doctors hadn't seen until really legalization happened, is when all of a sudden their numbers in the emergency departments went way up. And the only way to treat this is to, one, they have to stop using smoking or using cannabis products, and also to deal with the pain and the vomiting. It's using a capsaicin, like a hot pepper, that that spray, or a like a hot rag. Hot showers are the only way to make it stop. And there might be medicines, like pharmaceutical medicines that are on the market now that they have figured out, but it didn't react to, or didn't respond, I should say, to normal treatments for people who had nausea and vomiting. So this is something new. And so we have, yeah, and psychosis, I will say that, just kids who come in with psychosis, that as far as looking at a potential problem of cannabis use, and particularly high potency cannabis use, as I said, which increases your risk of developing psychosis. So we have that cannabis use disorder, we have cannabis hyperemesis syndrome, cannabis-induced psychosis, and then I'm trying to think of what else there is.
That's too many. Absolutely too
Yeah.
many.
And the main problem is just that it is seen as harmless.
Yeah.
And the perception of harm is so low because it's become legal that people think it's almost organic. And then there are all those other, THC isomers, what we call them, but THC, derivatives that are out there too that are falling through the legal, the loopholes that we have, and those are a real problem.
And not only is it being perceived or thrown out there as harmless, it's also being marketed as a cure for stress, a cure for anxiety, a cure for all these things that we know that that's not true. Why? Why is this a money thing?
Well, I think a lot of it is money for sure. And I do know that as far as the anxiety goes, I get this a lot when I talk to youth because they'll take it because they said it makes me less anxious.
Yeah,
And it's,
I hear that a lot too.
I think in maybe low amounts, there is some research that shows that yes, it can reduce anxiety for sure. And I know that for medicinal purposes, for actually people who have are in chemotherapy or are having those things where they are actually given THC to help with that, or seizures, CBD is given for pediatric seizures and things like that. So there are real, you know, places where it definitely has a purpose. But with anxiety in kids, the problem is it's the Wild West out there, and there you don't really know what you're getting. And this high potency THC, definitely studies to show that it increases anxiety. And if I can say this one thing, that when kids say it reduces my anxiety, and I say, okay, let's say it does for that time period, but when it wears off, what happens? Well, I'm anxious again. I said, so then you're not, you're just masking your anxiety, right? And this is true for, I hate to say it, but so many people, um, just masking what is actually the real root of the problem that they need to get to. And this is the problem.
I couldn't agree with you more. I think that's, all substance use, what we need to get to the root problem. And that's something I think largely we ignore in this country is, we look at it as moral failing. We look at it as your problem, uh, and we think the solution is just get them off that drug. We don't realize that there's probably a lot going on in the brain that we need to address, some cognitive things to address. Um, that are pushing them to the drug. But I like how you said also the Wild West, and that's so true, right? I mean, it's these are folks that are self-medicating themselves. They've made this decision, and they're trying to regulate, whether it's THC or whatever the substance is, and how often does that go well, right? I mean, that's almost you're asking for a train wreck at some point. Uh, what a lot of folks don't understand is that as these products evolve, there really is no testing, right? I mean, am I wrong there?
So, in the states where it's legal recreationally, and I should say medically, well, no, I shouldn't say that because usually medically they'll get like a prescription. But I will say that in the states where it is legal recreationally, that each state has its own testing before they can like have it in a dispensary there, but they're not all like some will test, and when I say testing, I'm talking about like testing for contaminants, testing for
Ah,
mold, pesticides.
not testing for
Sometimes,
brain
yeah,
damage.
yeah, percent THC. I honestly don't know, but I do know that there definitely have been, places where they've been called out and saying it has this much THC and it has less or it has more, whatever product. But definitely federally, we know it's not legal. And there's this push right now to make it, because it's been Schedule One, right? So
Yeah.
THC or marijuana has been Schedule One on the Controlled Substances Act, but I think that there's this push now to push it to Schedule 3, which means that then, well, I will say in the Schedule 1, meaning that it is highly addictive, right? Drugs in Schedule 1, highly addictive, and also shows no medicinal purpose, right? And so this is why people are like, we need to push it to Schedule 3 because it does have some medicinal purpose. And I will say that, for some things, particularly in those places where people have chemotherapy or they're going through that. And, and there are definitely, we need, as scientists, to really tease out all of the cannabinoids and find out what they do, because there's got to be, it's going to take years and years and years. But the problem is that when we look at these substances and looking at regulation for Schedule 3, they're saying, okay, we need to get it Schedule 3 so that places can do more research on it, right? So do more medical research. Okay, I can understand that, but the one thing that happens is that with the cannabis industry, from going from Schedule 1 to Schedule 3, when it's Schedule 1, they can't traffic a federally illegal substance, right? But when it goes to Schedule 3, now they can actually write off all business expenses. So basically, looking at the Schedule 1, because it's trafficking an illegal substance, it means that they can't write off any business expenses. So now if it moves to Schedule 3, all the cannabis dispensaries and all those cannabis farms, everybody will be able to write off their business expenses. So I think that there's a lot of push for that.
Yeah. Yeah. And outside the scheduling, the little interaction that law enforcement seems to have with these, these dispensaries and these cannabis stores is more of the, is it contaminated? Are they growing more than their permits allow? If it happens, that's more of the emphasis. I think I'm more concerned about the lack of the research and the things that we've talked about, like the triggers to psychosis,
Right.
The neuroplasticity, the rewiring of the brain,
Right.
because that's part of the resistance, right? You know, we don't know these answers, so let's just make it legal, and then it's almost the same. We're kind of running parallel to like cigarette industry, right? For many years, it was,
Bingo.
yeah, it was, this is safe, this is safe, this is
Yeah.
safe,
Philip
and
Morris, all that. Yeah,
right, and
totally.
behind the curtains, we were running these long-term research, and ultimately we came out and says this is not good, this is not safe, and I think a lot of us believe that this is exactly what's going to happen with marijuana. At some point, a lot of really trusted sources are going to say, yeah, we knew it initially, but now we have the concrete evidence.
But
Wow, right?
yeah, it's just sad that, kind of we're all lab rats, right? And I yeah, and that brings up to me, just as far as kind of the Wild West too, just all the Delta 8, Delta
Oh,
10,
yeah,
THCA, THCP, I mean, that just all of these that are coming out because of the Farm Bill loophole
yeah,
that they can make, because it's not not Delta 9 THC, that people can make these products. And I will say that these products that they're selling, I live in Tennessee, where
yeah,
it's not, you can only buy a product that has 0.3% Delta 9 by weight, right? Because that's in marijuana, that's illegal. That's really the only regulation for any of these Delta 8 products, Delta 10, that are on the market and people are buying. When you look at the distillate that is found from, someone making these products or a lab making these products, it is frightening about the number of other cannabinoids that are in there. Not to mention, did they get rid of all the solvent they use? Did they,
yeah,
there was an acid catalyst that was in there. It's that there's no regulation on that. I mean, and these kids are buying it, and again, they market it towards them.
yeah.
It's so infuriating to me that there's no regulation on that. And if I think it's gonna be too hard to push back legalization, right? We've already taken that big step. But if we can regulate the percent THC and just make it so these other products either go away or are on, have some type of where they have to follow these standards before they can even be put on the market, because we don't know what some of those other cannabinoids that are in that distillate, we have no idea what they do. And some of them, looking at them from a chemist perspective, they are so reactive. And I just think of people inhaling this in their lungs and, your proteins, everything that you have in there, and it, they would react in a second with what some of these cannabinoids, the groups that are on them. So it's frightening to me. And these kids they just think, oh, I can buy it here, right? So,
And there's resistance to those studies, and obviously it's the folks that are manufacturing and marketing these products.
right.
And every state's a little different, right? Like you said, you're in Tennessee, and this is what you do. I mean, every state's, we need a federal, we need someone to make a decision at the federal level and say this is what we're going to do, and because this goes into so many different directions. I mean, think of what are we telling our kids, right? I mean, this is a Schedule One drug. Federally, it's illegal. Yet you can go to this state or to this place, and I mean, there's so many different messages being thrown out there. It's crazy, right? And then we get this resistance. I get it all the time. Oh, you were with the DEA. Of course, you don't want to legalize these drugs because that's how you make money. I mean, just blows me away some of the conspiracy theories and some of the wacky things we hear. Like, I, we're not making money from marijuana being illegal. It just, that's not where my paycheck came from.
Right.
But people believe that, they really do. So from your perspective, your experience, what kind of resistance, what kind of pushback are you getting? I get the wacky year in law enforcement, but what are you getting?
I get from kids, I don't get much, but they don't say much. I do get from parents sometimes because there are parents who use too.
Yeah,
And I've been a part of some programs where these are kids who get caught for the first time with something, and they have a day where they have to come in, and it's their parents in one room and the kids in another room, and I speak to them, and the parents, I've had where parents have actually um, gotten violent, like coming up because they think that I am trying to take away their weed, and I'm totally serious, like it,
yeah.
and it's
Wow.
so it's
Very emotional.
I just keep telling them, I am trying to keep your kids healthy.
Yeah,
That's what I'm doing. I didn't mention anything about. I I mean, one of the things I do tell kids, and I do think that this message is important, is telling them that one, not everybody develops psychosis. In fact, it's a very few percent of people who use that develop psychosis. Looking at those risk factors, again, genetic predisposition, how much you're using, earlier first use, length of use, how long you've been using, all those things are risk factors. But oh, and another thing, if a child or a adult even, if you have had a psychotic experience or some type of episode where you've been extremely paranoid while under the influence, that is kind of a red flag. That means that you probably are more genetically susceptible to a long-term psychotic disorder if you continue to use. So I think it's very important. That's a message I tell kids. I
yeah.
tell
It's good
kids,
to know.
consider consider avoiding until you're 25,
Yeah,
until your brain's developed. At least that way they listen to me a little more, isn't saying, don't do this. And it's like, your brain, this is why I'm teaching you this, is because your brain is going through these magnificent changes and you don't want to mess, it's like thinking about being on a construction site. That's what I picture. Your brain's under construction and all these dump trucks and all these things. Everybody's working. And then all of a sudden this dump truck just comes in and dumps a bunch of sand in the form of THC. And the
yeah.
brain's like, how am I going to deal with this? I got to like shovel everything out and before I can continue working on the brain, on the development. And so I really feel that with kids, they're usually pretty good. There are some kids that will challenge me. And afterwards, I come up to them and I tell them, I said, you know what? I'm so proud of you. And really to tell them because they're challenging you. And it's like, you're really intelligent. I mean, use that.
Take that trip down. Yeah.
Don't smoke weed. But the parents, it's like they are that's the most pushback I have. And also the fact, and I don't know if you've ever dealt with this or if you've talked with parents, but sometimes I'll have things where I have an event and it's scheduled for the evening time for parents. And I do understand that it's very difficult when you've got kids and you've got to get dinner, you got to do all those things. But a lot of parents always have small participation from parents.
Oh my goodness. No, don't get me started. You know, when I first got into this, I was actually talking to Rocky Hearn, which I know you
Yep.
know
Yep.
Rocky. Rocky
He's
is
a
a
great
retired
guy.
DEA agent out in San Diego, and he's doing amazing work. So this is a
Totally
shout out to
amazing.
Rocky, who, by the way, Rocky, if you're watching this, I hope you're on this program at some point.
Yes, we need to get him on there.
Right. And he told me, he says, Brian, don't be surprised if less than 1% of parents come to your presentations. And I got to tell you, in my head, I'm thinking, like, you a bad presenter? Like, what's wrong with you, Rocky?
Yes.
And I'm putting myself on this pedal, like I'm going to get, you know, auditoriums full of parents. And the first time I did it, I had 6 parents show up, and it was humbling. And it was also, Rocky was right. He's doing this a lot longer than I have, and that was his experience, and it was crazy. One little quick story. I went to another school where they thought, all right, we're going to have several experts, and we're going to do it on 2 days. We're going to have it on a weeknight and a weekend. That way, if parents work, if they're busy, we give them 2 chances to come back to see this program. And every room of the school, not every room, but several rooms of the school had, teen pregnancy, nutrition, cyberbullying, sexual predators, drugs. That was me. I mean, you name it. If it impacts children, I mean, they had an expert there.
Wow.
2 different days, which I thought was a brilliant idea, right? Give the parents a choice, and give them 2 days. We had 17 parents total who showed up. 17. So it's frustrating. So you hit a nerve when you when you said that to me, is how do you, and I've had parents tell me that, hey, if we don't talk about this, my child won't use it. And I thought, are you not listening to music? Are you not watching TV? Or are you not on social media? I mean, they're goofy friends, drug traffickers. Someone's going to get this message to them at some point, and why not empower them with accurate factual information. So yeah, you
Yeah.
hit a nerve here.
No, I mean, and I understand because it's really frustrating to me. And the one thing I did hear though from another parent who did show up, and she said the reason she said I talked to some of the other parents, some of them were afraid what people would think of them if they think of their kids if they showed up, like
Oh,
their
yeah.
children were using. So they didn't want to look like
Ah,
I am the parent of a kid who's using. And so that's the reason. And so then, some of the schools have said, could we do it like on a, video, like, or just a
yeah.
like a PowerPoint presentation that's on Zoom that we can give. But it is a problem. And I've had the same thing with you about parents thinking that if I've been to a school and they've told me you can't use the word marijuana, weed, you can't say it. You can talk about it, but you can't say it. And it's insane to me. It's like you don't think
Frustrating.
that your child probably knows more than you about weed right now, and looking everything up online and talking to their friends, and so
Yeah.
it's like it's the elephant in the room, right? I mean, that's what we have to be able to have open communication. And the most incredible thing I believe with parents and children is that your parents or your children will listen to you. Even though they look like they're not listening to you, they are listening to you. And anytime you can open a conversation about these areas and all the areas you had when you had all those experts, that's golden. It's golden. Look at it as right on. I'm winning. I'm winning as a parent right now, right?
Absolutely. It's a
So
beautiful thing, and it's not hard. There's a commercial out in, I think, New Mexico, and I play it in my when I talk about opioids. I play it towards the very end. It's a 20-second commercial, and it's a family having a conversation with their children at the dinner table, and it's 20 seconds. And I tell people, I said, this is 20 seconds, and they have initiated a very important conversation that I promise you your kids are going to remember. And all the research is clear, right? The more we talk to them, it doesn't mean they're not going to use drugs, but the more that we have these conversations and we're open about these things, we're just empowering them, and that's a beautiful thing. So,
Yeah.
wow. Well, what practical strategies would you advise then to parents, educators, anyone listening? What kind of strategies would you advise?
Well, one, I always think knowledge is power. So I think the more that you can give them, and also to try and as a parent, to listen more. These are things that I wish I could have done with my kids. And here I was a teacher, so I am like the lecturer. I lecture, right? So I wish that I would have probably listened more and lectured less. And really asking questions is an amazing thing. So just opening everything with a question. And when they answer something, even if it's begrudgingly, with the eyes rolls and all that, ask them another question and just keep asking questions. And what you brought up about the dinner table, no phones at the
Oh,
dinner table, zero phones at the dinner table. Have it a time period where, one thing we did do as, with our kids is we played highs and lows. And so at the dinner table every night was asking, what was your high? What was your low today? Just having kids try to evaluate, looking at what made them happy and what, made them feel sad, or I should say what made them feel happy or sad. And I think that, we really, as a society, uh, we need to feel more. We need to, these things right here, which I have one right by me,
yeah.
are, they are they're rewiring our brain in a
Oh,
serious way, and making it so that it is just a constant hit. And some people they'll argue to me and they'll say, well, yeah, we have those phones and they're a distraction. But I used to remember, my dad or my grandfather would read the paper all day long. That's what they would do. They would just sit around with the paper. I'm like, yeah, but they could choose what they wanted to read. They could, it wasn't things that you weren't even asking for being thrown at you. I mean, and constant emails and all of this, social media and those algorithms and everything just being thrown at you 24/7. And knowing that your brain is just that dopamine, that basically it's the cue. Like I look at my phone, there's the cue. Oh, pick it up. That's a reinforcement, right? Pick it up, check it. I might be missing something, the fear of missing out. And everybody, I myself included, like it's it's become something that I'm hoping in the next couple of years, because I do think the more we start to interact together one-on-one, we have those conversations with our kids, we have our kids get out and do things besides video games, and have them get out and go play and be outside, do the things that when I was a kid, I mean, you had to learn to have conflict, you had to learn to do those things and figure out how to do them, and and communicate and look at each other in the eye. And I
yeah.
do think that having those conversations, and with your child, boundaries are essential. Kids love boundaries, even though they hate them when they have them. You know what I mean? But I think a lot of kids, I will say, they associate them, of course, healthy boundaries, but associate them with love. And I do, I just talk to your kids, listen to them, and do things together. Put your phone down when they're speaking to you, and listen to them and ask lots of questions, and know who their friends are.
Oh, yeah. Right.
Know their friends. Very, very important to know their friends. And if they start to change behaviors to where they're becoming more isolated, they don't speak to you as much, they don't look you in the eye, they have a whole different new set of friends, they're not doing as well in class, all those things, red flags. You got to get them some help.
Yeah, I came from the generation where we were expected to be outside.
That's right.
We had a curfew, and that's when you came home. So I like what you said, learning to fail. Having that those problems and getting through it without without mom and dad being there. I mean, I remember I was talking to a teacher years ago who'd been in the teaching profession for a long time, and he said, at one point when you gave a child a bad grade, parents would be like, they'd be on the child, right? You need to
Yeah.
study more, blah blah blah. Now you give them a bad grade, and the parents are coming to the school demanding that you retest them, or you're a mean teacher or whatever, and it's changed. And you mentioned the phones as well, and the social isolation is incredible, right? It's I mean we're glued to these things, and I know they're important, but we talked earlier about the root problems and why people turn to substances. At least some people, not everybody. Um, I think we're almost encouraging that type of behavior when we don't have face to face anymore, right? I mean, this is important. We can I'm sure if we spoke for several hours, there'd be things we disagreed on, and that's okay,
Yes.
right? We can still be friends. It's
Yes.
okay. But with social media, you instantly find someone who doesn't agree with you, whether it's politics or whatever it is, and then all of a sudden it's you're an idiot, you're this, you're that. I mean, it's incredible what it's happening. What it's doing to our society, especially to our children. And like you said, I mean, you can dive deeper into it and what's happening in the brain, right? I mean, the little research I've looked at, especially with the young people who are addicted to these things, right? It's part of their everyday functions, and it's
Leads to depression
yeah.
and anxiety. And it's just, yeah, we could go down that rabbit hole too. There's a lot, there's a lot of that, and I do believe it's a great place, as you had at your conference, the Only Two Makes conference. That was great. About it's a great place for kids to find uh, drugs. You know what I mean? And
Yeah.
so this is a big thing with parents. There is a book out called The Anxious Generation, and it's so good. A great book. Jonathan Haidt, I think is his name, uh, but he actually talks about his rules are no smartphones until high school, no social media until they're 16, and then the other one was it was going out to play, and oh, there was something else too. I forget what it is,
I
but it's
believe I follow him. He's brilliant. It's
brilliant book.
yeah,
Yeah. And it is the truth. I mean, it was our, I mean, the biggest thing is those smartphones. When kids have the world at their fingertips, they can look up anything, anything. And what they're seeing is not, most of it's not real.
yeah, yeah, crazy.
So, so I just think that there's a lot of more, I would say, just spending more time together as a family unit. There's a family that lives down the street from me, and they have Sunday meetings,
Yeah,
which I love. The whole
yeah,
family gets together, no phones. They talk about their week. They talk about what happened their week, and they have a meeting, and they all just hang out. And it's the closest family I've ever seen. And those kids now are in their 20s, and they come back every weekend, hang out, and I just it's beautiful. And I
yeah.
think that that's we need
Yeah,
to bring the family unit back.
yeah. I like how you said that's beautiful, and it's exactly what it is. It's you've answered so many of my questions in our conversation, which is perfect. So just a few more.
Okay.
Uh, so now let's shift to the listener who might be struggling with this. What piece of advice would you give him or her? That might be using a substance. Let's say THC.
Mhm. There is a great app which is called Clear 30, and it's for people who are struggling with marijuana cannabis use disorder. And it's a wonderful app, and it actually is kind of something that keeps you on check. So I think it checks in with you on a daily basis, and has a lot of kind of mental health, um, you know, uh, pieces to it to just help you to get through. Um, I, I do think that if you are struggling, know that you're not alone, and you're not a failure, and you are, um, a person that this happens to everybody in some means or another, and to know that there is help for you. There's Marijuana Anonymous. There is Maranon for people who are dealing with people suffering from marijuana use disorder or cannabis use disorder. But just to uh, know that there are people out there, that you're not alone, and that you can get help. And looking at someone who, particularly, who had a son who struggled, and watching him suffer through his addiction, there are so many things that I wish I could have done differently. And one of the biggest things was just really just telling him how much I love him, and if you're someone who knows someone struggling, reach out a hand. And there's so much shame and stigma that follows people who suffer from addiction, and it keeps them from getting the help they need. And just know that you know there are people out there who will see you, and who will see that incredible person that you truly are. And this is something that you can kick with the right help.
And thank you for mentioning the stigma. That's something that it's another nerve that you hit, and it's something that really frustrates me is just be human to each other, right? I mean,
Right.
I don't agree with drug use, but we can't abandon these people.
Right.
They're our sons, they're our daughters, they're our
Right.
family, our friends, our neighbors. I mean, it's if a genie came out of a bottle, that'd be one of my wishes, was to eliminate stigma. And think of how beautiful this world would be if we didn't judge people, especially folks who are struggling with these very real things.
Yeah.
So, wow. Well, well, actually, this is your chance. How can our listeners, like I have millions of
Yes,
listeners, right?
you're going to, Brian.
Got to start somewhere, right? How can they learn more about you? How can they learn more about you, your work?
Yeah.
How can they follow you?
So if you go to it's Speaking Through Me. If someone just searches Speaking Through Me, it's actually the film that I made.
Okay.
That It was an educational documentary that had three young adults who suffered from eating disorders, from uh, severe depression, anxiety, and suicide attempts. And my obviously my son's story, but then another person who suffered from addiction to heroin and fentanyl. And it tells their stories, but then also talks about really that even though they were three different trajectories, they took three different trajectories that really affected their lives in a very difficult way. It really all came down to them being young, very young, 10 and 11, even younger, and not feeling like they're enough. And so it really speaks to talking to yourself. So it goes through a lesson in the adolescent brain, and how important how we speak to ourselves, what self-compassion is, what neuroplasticity is, what synaptic pruning, what's going on, and how we can use that, and kind of mindful techniques to try to better our brain health and mental health. And so the if you search Speaking Through Me, it's squarespace.com. But if you just search Speaking Through Me documentary, you'll find the site. You just click on it, and it'll take you to at the Warren Center site. And it has all kinds of resources on cannabis. And it has resources on mental health, on like any place if you're struggling with eating disorders. Anyway, it's a wealth of information, mainly all geared towards mental health, and realizing that you are enough.
You are enough. I will make sure we put a link to whatever description and whatever information that we send out on this podcast, so listeners can easily find that resource. So thank you for that, and
Right.
thank you for your time. This has been enlightening for me. I've learned a lot. I really appreciate you. I appreciate your work. I appreciate you sharing, your story, your experiences. You know, I especially, with Anders, I think it's
Yeah.
beautiful what you're doing here. You know, you're Anyway, it's a beautiful thing. So I appreciate you. And yeah, thank you.
Well, and I thank you, Brian. And like I said, such an honor to be the first guest. And I truly am grateful for all the work you're doing and reaching all those kids, and you're saving a lot of lives. So thank you for everything you do.
Thank you. And thank you for listening. Again, my name is Brian Townsend, and you just listened to Only 2MG Inside the Crisis, episode 1. I want to leave you with this. In 2023, we lost 107,543 people to drugs in this country. Now, we don't know the official number yet for 2024, but provisional data provided by the CDC indicates that we lost just over 80,000 people last year. Now, I'm happy to see a reduction, but these aren't just numbers, they're people, and we have a lot more work to do. So be kind, be safe, and be the positive change you want to see in this world.